So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 6th roundtable, which is the last roundtable for the day and for the conference. We hope to strictly be done by 4 o'clock so that you can have an early closure. The session that we are starting now is on collaboration between universities and humanitarian actors for a better impact and improved ethics. And it's going to be moderated by David Williamson. So David, please take over the floor. We will go until 4 p.m.
Okay. So it's let's consider it as a prospective, a collective brainstorm, because now we want to work together. We want to tackle key issues to better integrate the question of humanitarian action into the major challenges, social, political, but most of all, humanity challenges in most vulnerable areas. Of course, research is part of only one part. We should insist on this, because research, science is one part of this problem, of this issue. So are we together? So we let's make it an open discussion, but to orient a bit this discussion, we would have at least 3 pitches or 4 maybe, only 3, okay. 3 pitches, one on climate forecast and the question of climate forecast-based financing. It's a very, very strategic question. The question of that would be with Halima Saado Abdullahi. The question of NGOs, how to work with NGOs to generate data and to better utilize research. This would be with Nassim. And then we would address the question of protracted displacement situation, how to make data useful for it. And that would be with patients from RED SS, Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat in Kenya, hosted by DRC. And the question for funding, unfortunately, our guest from the French Agency for Development could not attend. But there would be, of course, very much attentive to the ideas and to the concept and to the abstract we would transmit to them. So let's start maybe with the question of climate forecast. Thanks a lot, Halima, for...
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'd like to stand so that I can see the screen. And just to make a slight interesting afternoon correction is that I would be Halima, except Halima is not able to come. So I'm presenting on her behalf, and my name is Maureen Ambani. I work at the International Center for Humanitarian Affairs as the climate advisor. And I'm sure Halima will be happy that I speak on her behalf. Okay, so I'm going to address the concern about focus-based financing, which is an approach that has been implemented by the Red Cross for a number of years across different countries in the world. Starting up in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda, we have a collective project trying to implement the same approach across the entire country. And I'm going to share perspectives on that from the work that we have been doing. Maybe a quick one, just so that I know I don't have to spend a lot of time on the concept. How many of us have heard of focus-based financing? If they could raise your hands. Okay, good. there is at least a good number in the room. So feel free to interact with them as well to learn more about their approach. If I could move to the next slide. So I'll specifically talk about drought, which we know in this particular region, that's the Greater Horn of Africa, it is one of our biggest challenges that causes a lot of humanitarian consequences in the region. And just by looking at the latest report from the IGAD, that's the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in the region, it said that in 2018, 27 million people faced acute food insecurity in the region. And you can see the statistics are quite high for the number of people who are affected, cutting across Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Uganda, Djibouti. And a lot of appeals went out between 2017, 2018, asking for humanitarian finance to support the people who are severely affected by the drought and the acute food insecurity. So the question is, should we continue letting this happening in the region? Should it be the same story all over again, that at the end of a rainfall season, a lot of people are affected, we are putting out calls for humanitarian assistance, and we are asking our donors, put in more money, which we know sometimes can be a challenge. The next slide. The reality is that in many of these countries, Kenya being one of them, we do have an existing drought early warning system, but still we are seeing a large number of people getting affected by drought. So the question is, what's happening with the early warning? Why isn't it translating into seeing at least fewer numbers of people getting affected by drought and specifically food insecurity? Why is it that every time it comes up and it's more people getting affected? So one of the things that we have noted working on this as a Red Cross is that unfortunately we tend to be very slow to react to early warning. And especially when it comes to financing, the financing tends to come very slow. A lot of times the financing comes mostly for response and not necessarily for anticipatory action, to support the preparedness we need to make sure that millions of people are not always caught up in the cycle of getting food insecure because of drought. Yeah? And so our proposal is to enhance a more anticipatory approach where we are using forecasts, scientific forecasts, and local knowledge as well as good historical information on what's happening with vulnerability exposure to drought and other effects, such that we can start to trigger early warning, yes, but quite critically, early action and the related finance before millions of people are affected by the disaster. So the proposal is, can we take advantage of the time between when a forecast is issued and before the drought disaster, for example, happens, to take advantage of that window of opportunity to help people to take anticipatory action so that we are not stuck into the same cycle. The next slide, please. And so some of the questions that have been emerging as we have been trying to implement this approach across Kenya is, okay, we are talking about drought, but what is drought? Is it, let me now get a bit techy, is it agricultural drought? Is it hydrological drought? Is it meteorological drought? Or is it socioeconomic drought? Yeah? What are we really addressing when we talk about drought? So we asked this question to a number of stakeholders across Kenya, and you can see some of the results. That a lot of people were saying, okay, it's agricultural drought. That is the problem when you're talking about drought, yeah? And when you come down and ask people, okay, what impacts of drought should we be addressing quite critically with early action? Yeah, you can see the results at the bottom again. Water scarcity, very important. Food insecurity, very important. Reduced crop yield and lack of pasture related to livestock and pastoralist systems, which are quite widespread in the region, yeah? But then when we zoom into food insecurity, again, we ask the question, what is food insecurity? What do we mean by food insecurity? What does it look like, yeah? And again, with a number of stakeholders, we started to explore this question. You can see the beautiful spider at the end is people trying to tell us what are all of these things that are connected to food insecurity, which are about Crop production, yes, which is about markets. It's about access to water. It's also about infrastructure. It's also about policies. So the question is, how are we going to address all of this in terms of early action? Can all of these things be addressed together? And quite importantly, can they be forecasted? Can we have impact-based forecast in terms of moving away from just, oh, there's not going to be enough rainfall this season, so let's think about what you're going to do, to forecast that will tell us, for example, the markets are going to fail, so people will not have access to enough food. What are we going to do about it? To tell us things as, for example, there's going to be significantly reduced crop yield. It means that people will not have enough to eat, such that we can make sure that our early actions are targeted to the problem that we are going to address, and hopefully the forecast can tell us enough about that. But then, it's a forecast. It's not going to tell us this is exactly what will happen. It will give us an indication. This is potentially what might happen, yeah? And in the meteorological world, they'll tell you it is a probabilistic forecast. So it's telling you a percentage chance of something happening. But just because it has, for example, 80% chance that the rains are going to fail, there's still the 20% chance that it may turn out to be just good. Yeah? So the question has been, are we willing to take the risk of maybe doing drought prepositioning, humanitarian action on drought, for food insecurity, considering 80%, and maybe it might just turn out all right? So the question is, are we willing to act in vain based on a forecast? And to what extent are we willing to act in vain based on our forecast, knowing it's not going to tell us 100% this is what's going to happen? But at the same time, recognizing that that information, as imperfect as it is better than having no information at all. So these are some of the questions we are grappling with as we are trying to implement this kind of anticipatory approach. So, coming back to the question about collaboration with universities and research, yeah? A number of projects have been put forward which consist a consortia of different organizations, as you can see there. One of which is called the Forecast-Based Preparedness Action, and is bringing together various institutions in Kenya and in the UK and in the region, that is the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center, to start to help us address some of these questions. Like, for example, how can we create useful forecasts that can really help us to predict drought? Drought, in as far as we can define it concretely, this is what we mean. Can we start to forecast this? And we also recognize that we have existing early warning system. How best can we integrate these kinds of forecasts into the existing system such that we are taking more of an anticipatory approach, right? And then there's this other project we have just started with the University of Amsterdam, together with the University of California, Santa Barbara, to start to ask ourselves, okay, can we really model and forecast food insecurity? What does that look like? Can we start to take advantage of technology such as machine learning to be able to anticipate food insecurity and take action on it before it happens? So these are some of the examples of the collaborations we are having at the Red Cross, trying to address some of these emerging questions, but then some of it is raising even more questions than we had before. The next slide. So, how best can we promote these kinds of work to continue going on that brings together the researchers, the meteorological departments, the mandated institutions dealing with drought in the region, key government actors like Treasury, to be able to address these kinds of issues? And as we have seen, the humanitarian work is really a ripe ground to be able to pick out key research questions, and research questions that matter to humanitarian work, that can really help us to make sure we are prepositioning our humanitarian work to really help the most vulnerable, hopefully before disasters occur. And my other suggestion is that there's also a lot of evidence and learning that is needed, especially with the governments, with the donors, to say, for example, this kind of anticipatory approach that we are proposing makes sense. It makes economic sense, it helps the most vulnerable, it can really bring down like the numbers of people who are constantly affected by drought. We need a lot of knowledge on that. Okay, what is the benefit of that? What sorts of structures, operational structures, should we be able to set up to be able to implement this anticipatory kind of approach? Yeah? And quite importantly, we can collaborate to start to understand this is the need, yeah? Can research help us to address the need that we have as humanitarian actors to make sure that even the interventions we put out make sense. The intervention that we put out are also convincing to our donors to put in money in a game of risk, because again, we are pushing the idea of using a forecast that's not 100% certain, yeah? Can we also use the evidence to convince our donors that even though there's a 20% chance that it will go the other way, it still makes sense for us to invest in this intervention and take early action? And quite importantly, I would say that we really need the research to be co-produced by the researchers, by the universities, by the humanitarian actors, to make sure that the research is not just going to be sitting somewhere in a desk or somewhere in a cupboard, but it's really going to inform operationally what we do, and will also raise for us the kind of support we need as humanitarian actors. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And so we had a first overview of the numerous problems in climate science and its linkage with humanitarian stakes. But now let's ask Nassim to tell us about working with NGOs.
Some of the things I will say are familiar to all of you, so hopefully it'll just be also a bit of a recap of things that were mentioned over the last 2 days. I don't have a PowerPoint, and that's done on purpose, because some of the things I'll speak to today, I don't feel comfortable putting in writing. I think we need to acknowledge that we all work in a very politicized setting, and that data is power, and that lessons that we learn from the field are very often not even publicized or shared. So I'm not putting it in writing for that reason, because I feel comfortable talking to you. I don't necessarily feel comfortable with the information I'm sharing to be distributed widely, and you'll get to understand why in a second. My presentation was originally entitled Building the Capacities of NGOs to Generate Data and Utilize Research. I don't feel comfortable with that term capacity building, because I think it's very much about learning together and learning to work together. So researchers like me understanding what it is to do operational research, and then NGOs understanding what academics can offer in terms of applied research. And the best moments from the research we have done, and you can look up who we are, Samuel Hall, online, the best moment of the research we have done is to bring actors together through data and standards and questioning concepts, agreeing on what is essential to measure, agreeing on indicators even when they're not perfect. So I want to go over kind of 3 lessons learned from the last decade of working on applied research and supporting NGOs across various different countries. And I'll cover the question of research uptake, because I think that is what we can all agree is a big problem in our field. Independence and accountability. On both ends, accountability as researchers and accountability as NGOs to the data and to the evidence produced. And third, setting standards. So I'll speak to these 3 issues very quickly, and patients I know will follow up on a lot of these. Some of the best examples of our work on research uptake, on the potential of research to shape policies, comes from Kenya. One of the first collaborations I did with the Danish Refugee Council and REDS in particular was to look at the implication of devolution on refugee issues. So in 2014, well before talking about localization in 2015-16, or before the CRF and the global commitments on refugee issues, DRC had decided to do a research on the potential that devolution brought to solving some of the problems around refugee integration. So we worked in Garissa, we worked in Turkana, we worked closely with communities, refugees and hosts alike, and with county representatives. And this was, to this day, one of the best collaborations we've had, because county authorities worked with us, not just on providing us data, but also on co-producing the recommendations together. We paved the way and identified education, health, and fiscal support as the key areas where county governments saw an opportunity to bring refugees and hosts together. So this was in 2014, us talking about integrating refugees us talking about integrated services with county governments. And a lot more could have been done with the data we produced, and the report is public, but a lot more could have been done to take that from the local to the national and to make sure that DRC could make that one of its flagship focus areas in Kenya. They're probably going to come back to it, I think, next year because of the CRF implications in this country. But somehow I feel like we've lost a few years. And I also feel like we've raised expectations with county governments. We came up with a lot of great ideas and recommendations in 2015. Most of them haven't been implemented. So what is our role in terms of generating data, raising expectations, and then what do we deliver after that? And that's really a shared responsibility between academics and practitioners. I have other examples from other organizations where we've worked, for example, in Kakuma on value chain analysis. And we told one of our partners very clearly, tomato value chain, leather value chain, this is what you should do in Kakuma if you really want to generate work for refugees and hosts. They picked one value chain, replaced another, and kind of did a mishmash of the evidence that we had brought, picked what they liked, dismissed what they thought was not so well argumented, and picked something else. And so what's also difficult is when partners pick and choose the data that we offer. It's actually a package, and our data comes on the basis of literature review, meaning in our work, we used a lot CIRAD's Agricultural Research Center work and what they had produced across many years in this country. So we built on what others had recommended, and we wanted to push it forward. In the end, half of what we said basically was taken on board, and it's not to congratulate ourselves, but the tomato value chain worked, the other value chain didn't, and now they're coming back to it. Again, we've lost a few years on that. We're allowed to fail, obviously, but what is the point of paying researchers to do work and then not listening to them? So I feel very much that we're not always listened to, and that can be better worked on. And that kind of brings me to the question, to the second point on independence and accountability. As researchers, I founded Samuel Hall so that I could be an academic in the field, very much like Eloi was saying this morning, not working on Afghanistan or on Africa, but in Afghanistan and in Africa. And so there's a responsibility I have to make sure that that research is made public. So on our website, most of our studies are made public. But very conveniently, every once in a while, we're not allowed to make some data public. We're not allowed to publish some reports. And that's the politicization of research and of aid, obviously, and something we need to be a lot more vocal about and a lot more conscious about. Let me give you an example. We did a midterm evaluation of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, their investment in Kalo Bay. We spoke quite a bit about Kalo Bay today. It's a settlement in Western Kenya, a new model for refugee integration. What we showed there wasn't the rosy picture that the European Union wanted to show, not the rosy picture UNHCR wanted to show. What we spoke in there, though, wasn't just critical. It showed also how host communities don't really trust this program. They don't send their children to the schools that are built for refugees. They don't think the quality is good. You know, and when you have 160 kids sitting in a classroom in Kalo Bay, you understand why the host community doesn't really want to send their children to school. And so that's the reality behind it. The clinic that the Kenya Red Cross runs in Kalo Bay is actually not the best clinic from an equipment sense, from a resource sense, because they're not even procuring their own equipment. They have to go through UNHCR. But it's actually a space for interaction, and it's a space for social cohesion. And so one of the outcomes that was completely unexpected is what a civil society member here was able to do in terms of bringing together mothers, host community, refugee community mothers together, children and others. And we don't talk about that because that's not necessarily in the reporting framework that was built for the program. So we're missing out on some lessons learned. And so as much as we provided all of this information in a report, and there were strong reactions, notably from UNHCR, we weren't allowed to make it public. So you'll find a really short executive summary on our website where that information rests. And what was really difficult about that research is we were supposed to measure effectiveness, but we had no financial data. We don't know how much money UNHCR had, what it gave to partners, and how that money was spent. There was no monitoring data on the part of implementers. There were a lot of academic researchers in the field at the same time as us, Oxford, for example, but no one was actually sharing data. You know, when we asked, can we have access to your data, they said, sure, let me publish my academic papers, and in 2-3 years, when that will be done, I'll give you all the data. Well, in 2-3 years, the children who are today children will be youth, and the issues will have changed. so there's still very much a proprietary approach to data, a lack of data, and then a lot of defensive reactions over the critical data that we found. So so what prevents kind of stronger data generation and utilization of research? In this example, we try to provide recommendations to the EU to go around some of the blockages we saw on being researchers in the field. We mentioned how there should be bilateral investments, so not just going by the one UN model and putting in a big chunk of money to UNHCR, but actually trying to see pathways for giving money directly to the Kenya Red Cross and working with them on social cohesion, not just a medical center. So we're trying to see how to recommend more support for civil society actors, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who know best the host and the refugee communities. We advise to bring a learning partner on board as well, and to integrate a learning approach to this new model. UNHCR's response was, we can add an M&E officer in our team. Well, an M&E officer sitting in the UNHCR with a UNHCR badge will not have the same access to people as a learning partner might. So we really need to shift the understanding that it's not just about one person doing M&E, but it's about a collective change and a collective endeavor towards data. And we advise donors to enforce data sharing, because if they're not going to put in their contracts, your data, the data is not just your data, but the data should be shared across others, then obviously there will never be any data sharing. And so much of the responsibility stays with the donors. The final point I want to cover is the issue around standards, to make sure that we speak a common language as well, because I think sometimes the way we understand concepts is different. And I think in the previous panel, the whole discussion around policy design and implementation also was a bit about that. How do we unpack these concepts and what do we make of them? We need to build standards that can drive practice. We need to build tools that everyone can agree to. I often hear there's a lot of data that NGOs generate. Yes, but first of all, there's not much analysis that comes of it because it's not shared. And second, I'm not sure much of the data is strong. I'm not sure much of the data follows the right sampling strategies or the right framing of questions. There needs to be a lot more cooperation between us and all of you, and you in the room among yourselves, to actually define the right indicators, to define the right questions, because there's enough lessons learned from all over the world for us to know what should be in a self-reliance index, what should be in a resilience index. There's enough of that available, but those conversations are not happening. So we started to do some of that. In Afghanistan, we've built a multidimensional integration index to basically measure what happens to refugees when they return home. And that was after 15 years and 6 million people had returned, and there was still no knowledge of how they fared after the return. So I think we can avoid waiting 15 years and avoid waiting for millions of people to suffer or benefit from return to be able to learn from them. And REDS is doing now a lot of standard setting here. The standards won't be perfect, and they don't need to be necessarily. I know Save the Children is working on child-sensitive durable solutions framework. Refuge Point is working on a self-reliance index. It's taking years. We're part of the community of practice with them, trying to guide them into how to set those standards. It's a conversation that's a long-term one, but it really needs to start now. And I think just to conclude, I would say the biggest failings right now in terms of working with NGOs and utilizing research is, again, publishing when it suits and not publishing always. There's a responsibility to put the critical analysis out there, and NGOs still very much hide behind, we need operational recommendations to not, operational research to not show some of the more critical research. There's a lack of agreement on data sharing. Ownership still trumps data sharing. And sharing data happens, but then without carefully looking at the sampling. So data is not just good because it's there because 1,000 people were surveyed. We need to look at what the methodology behind it was. And again, working together on tools. I think most of the tools that still are used today in the humanitarian sector are still quite weak. And that's where we come in and we can support in developing them together. And it's a lot about what you said, Maureen, co-creation, co-production, sitting together and bringing the solutions together. None of us have it right, but together we can have it right. So if we agree to work together on tools, if we agree to share data, then at least we can start having a conversation around setting standards and learning from past mistakes. And I don't think the UN can lead that conversation. I don't think the donors will lead that conversation. I really think it's NGOs and civil society, and your voice is much stronger than ours as researchers. So please, take the lead on that. We very much need it.
Thank you very much, Nassim, for this excellent experience, which probably is questioning also the way our academic world is working, and maybe we need to adapt also to this humanitarian and humanity challenge, and we need to have some reflections concerning data analysis, publication, intellectual property rights, in order to make these solutions emerge in such dramatic case studies. And now we will have the fantastic experience of patients concerning precisely the data.
Good afternoon. My name is Patience Kiara. I'm coming from the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat. If you allow me, I'll just speak from here, but we'll coordinate together. So just to give you a brief overview of my presentation and what I'm going to be talking about, I will introduce you a bit to REDS, because I know I've had a number of questions about what is REDS. A few of you definitely already know about REDS, and a few others not. And then we'll go through a multi-stakeholder approach to produce and use evidence. And I'll really be building upon what Nassim has already spoken about. How do we then use the evidence that is being produced? And then how do we make the data that is available useful to inform programming and policy? And then how then are we able to take some of the learning from Somalia and Ethiopia, where REDS has done a lot of work, to inform the work here in Kenya and in other regions, and also to highlight some key challenges and possible opportunities to do better together. So just to give you a brief overview of REDS, we are a consortium of 14 NGOs. We started our operation in 2015, and the objective is really to support continuous and consistent engagement on durable solutions in this region, in terms of one, programming support and having better programming towards durable solutions for displacement affected communities, and on policy influencing. So we are not an implementing agency, but we are a coordination and knowledge management hub. So we produce a lot of knowledge, and not only producing, but also helping our membership and partners to synthesize the information that is already out there to better program. So in terms of the pillars that we are working on, there is 4 main pillars: one on research, solutions analysis, and knowledge management, which is our almost like anchor pillar, because from that, then we are able to provide programming support, and also to support members and partners to do adaptive programming based on the context and based on the learning that we are generating. Another pillar is on policy dialogue, and definitely on coordination. So our work is anchored on 4 main learning principles. So to always ensure that we are collaborative. I think we've talked quite a bit extensively about collaboration, about being able and willing and flexible enough to adapt, and ensuring that our work is also iterative, so we can have a common understanding of basic principles and have a common understanding of what does actually durable solutions for displacement affected communities mean, and to make sure that our work then is very much locally led, so that the solutions that we propose, or solutions that we are hoping to achieve, will be feasible and sustainable. So adaptive learning and continuous learning is really at the center of our work. So I think some of the challenges that have been highlighted by Maureen and Nassim really relate to how the evidence is being produced. And so that is why we say that the process of producing the evidence is a critical success factor onto how that evidence is going to be used and taken up to inform programming and to inform policy. So just to give you a bit of an analysis of how we do the research that we produce, and how we have a collaborative, multi-stakeholder approach to producing research, is just to give you like a 7-step model that we have jointly developed with partners and with the membership. Firstly, to be able to really define what knowledge gap actually exists, because sometimes the data that is being collected is very much project-based and not necessarily to answer an overall knowledge gap. And so we end up duplicating a lot and collecting data that is not necessarily useful in a larger sense, but only very useful for a short-term 3-month project, or if we are lucky enough, a 1-year project, and then that's it. So if we are collectively able to really define what the knowledge and practice gap is, that can be addressed not only by humanitarian actors, but also by other actors, such as development actors. That's a critical step that we usually take. So in terms of that, we also set up a multi-stakeholder technical committee. So when I say a multi-stakeholder technical committee, is really to guide the research and the outcome of that research, and to be able to have not only humanitarian actors leading the research, but also to include academia as part of the technical committee, to include researchers, to include the government as well, because oftentimes we exclude other actors from the production of the research itself, and even the creation of the research agenda, we exclude other actors, and we tend to work very much in silos based on our own mandate. But I think what has been really critical for us to work more towards is making sure that we really are able to complement each other, and also identifying the fact that while as REDS and many humanitarian actors produce operational research, and the academia and the researchers, institutions and universities will focus more on fundamental research, I think there is an element there of complementarity, and how do we ensure that we actually complement one another, while still bearing in mind that our accountability is different, because the accountability for humanitarian actors and a research institution such as REDS is really on how do we improve programming and policy. And on researchers or universities, the accountability is quite different. But then we can complement one another within a technical committee that can really guide the research, so that we don't always have all the necessary expertise. So that's why we need other actors to also come on board, to put it simply. And then we also conduct at the very beginning, as part of co-creation of a research scoping mission, to refine the research questions and to engage with displacement affected communities, again, which is a missing link. We often do not engage enough with displacement affected communities in producing the evidence. And so their aspirations or their intentions or their priorities get left out. And I think we are all aware of that, but because of, and we keep talking about research financial constraints or time constraints, and we don't end up engaging enough with displacement affected communities, or refining the research questions in such a way that they will be useful, and that what comes out of that research is actually going to be taken up. So primary data, now we get into collecting the data. And then another key aspect that we usually prioritize is operational workshops with a wide range of different stakeholders. So, and this is not easy to do. It's actually quite difficult to have the government present, UN agencies present, and donors present. And we've had that experience with Samuel Hall, who has supported quite a number of our researches, to have all of these different actors coming together to collectively analyze the findings and to collectively analyze the data is not easy. But I think it's a critical step in terms of that information and evidence being useful. And you will find that since we all are coming with very different hats, the humanitarian hat, with another agency with a development hat, another agency with a government hat, very different backgrounds, very different expertise, you find that there's quite a lot of disagreement and debates around the data. But if data is does not inform joint analysis, then it's really not useful. So that's why we really prioritize operational workshops to be able to discuss the findings together and to develop jointly the recommendations. Again, something that becomes that is not prioritized enough is dissemination and uptake. So oftentimes the research is done, we do a very good production, do very nice designs and good pictures, but then those reports often get shelved, and they never get, we never go beyond that and to really invest the time and the resource that it takes to support dissemination and uptake of the recommendations, and even just to synthesize the information in palatable forms or palatable formats that can be used by different actors. Policymakers are not going to read a 120-page report. We know that. So how do we address that? Is it in producing policy briefs that are based on the findings, that is just like a 2-pager, 3-pager that can be used and can easily give the information? And for instance, if we're engaging the displacement affected communities, if what we produce is not in a language they can understand, that it really becomes useless for them. So investing in a dissemination and dissemination plan and uptake is something that really oftentimes gets overlooked, and we really need to go back to that. And that also informs our monitoring of the research and uptake. Because again, this is something that doesn't get done as often as it should be. How can we monitor the uptake of recommendations? Are the recommendations actually useful? Are they being used? Are they not being used? They've just been shelved. And do we have indicators and even a common approach towards which we can measure the impact of the researches that we're producing? So I will just quickly run through the next slides, because I've spoken quite a bit on the other one. But this multi-stakeholder approach is really critical. And like I had mentioned earlier, for us to have a meaningful research that will inform programming and policy, we must be able to put in the time that is required. A minimum of 6 to 8 months is taken to actually do an operational research, that is for REDS. And with the first 3 months actually being an inception period of adapting and changing and refining the questions and really making sure that we have a collaborative approach towards that research. And also in terms of engaging national research institutions. Oftentimes, we know that the humanitarian sector in this region engages very much international consultants and international researchers, but we do not take advantage or even do not make use of the local researchers who actually have better context analysis and knowledge, particularly of the sociopolitical dynamics and nuances in a particular context. So we aim very much to also engage with local researchers and local institutions, local universities in co-creation of the research agenda and in co-production of the actual research. And this is also a way also to strengthen the capacity of the local researchers to identify knowledge gaps and actually be able to address them. So focusing on locally led processes is really key, and as I had mentioned earlier, meaningful engagement of displacement affected communities. And so this is just to show you a framework, a common logical framework around which REDS is using to support joint analysis. So we know that not all agencies will be able to produce all the data that is mentioned there. So this is a framework that has been adapted from the Interagency Standing Committee Framework on Durable Solutions for IDPs. So we use this, as Nassim was saying, as a way to harmonize our data collection, our joint analysis, and our collective outcomes. So in terms of durable solutions processes, these 8 criteria are really critical, and all of us can sort of find themselves somewhere around this framework. So while not all of us might be able to produce all the data that is on these 8 criteria, all of us have data that we are producing. And it's really not, the challenge is not that the data is not there, but the challenge is that the data is not jointly analyzed, so it does not inform collective outcomes. And the challenge, again, is that we tend to be very protective of our data, and you will see from, just to give you an example, you will see this is, so at the end of the analysis that we conduct based on those 8 criteria, sorry, it's 2 slides, yes. At the end of the joint analysis that we produce based on these 8 criteria is this very colorful infographic. So this infographic is based on those 8 criteria that I previously showed you. And the red shows you that there's actually interventions towards achievement of durable solution on that criteria are far from being met. The orange will show you that there are interventions and investments that are supporting advancement of durable solutions on that criteria. The white, and you can see it's the predominant color shows you that data is missing there, and if it's not missing, it's not useful enough to inform a joint analysis, because it's either project-based, it's just an assessment that was done for a 3 months project, and that was it. And the challenge again is the fact that the data is not there can be a comparison between the displaced community and the host community because of how we produce the data. And we are very well known of criticizing each other's methodology, and sometimes indeed the methodologies are quite varied, of different qualities, and we can't really agree on the data. And so you see we don't have a joint analysis on quite a number of the different criteria. So just to show you then that we need to strike a balance between consensus building and accuracy. Not to mean that we need sorry, I went back. I'm so sorry, I keep forgetting. So not to mean that we should compromise on the accuracy of the data, but we should focus more on consensus building around the data that already exists, around what data we've already produced. We need to be able to come together not only as humanitarian actors, but also development actors, academia, researchers, government, private sector, and jointly analyze that data in order to inform a common analysis. And the reason, the implication of the fact that we don't often jointly analyze data means that it undermines the development of a common narrative, and the fact that we are speaking very different languages, we have very different concepts that mean different things to different actors. And I think it's really time, if we are going to walk the humanitarian development peace nexus, to really walk the talk on having joint analysis. I'm now on slide 10. So I think I'll skip that and go to slide 11 so I can move a little faster. So we are using a number of tools to inform knowledge gaps and adapt programming. One is a solutions analysis, which is based on the previous slides that I showed you on the 8 criteria. And we analyzed your achievement of durable solutions or progress towards durable solutions based on those 8 criteria, which have been agreed. It's an internationally agreed framework, which can be applied in any displacement context. So we use those 8 criteria, and every other year, we go back to the recommendations of that solutions analysis and see, okay, so this is where we were 2 years ago. How far have we moved towards achievement of durable solutions? How far have the recommendations been taken up? And what gaps still exist, and where do we need to prioritize our investments? Another tool that we use is the annual aspiration survey. So again, going back to putting our accountability to displacement-affected communities at the center. So these last tools, aspirations surveys and the social accountability platform, are really geared more towards understanding the community. So the annual aspiration survey is a 4-year longitudinal survey to better understand the profiles, the aspirations, the pull and push factors, how displacement-affected communities interact with the institutions and interact with the different programmings that are meant to address the issues of the displacement-affected communities. So that way we are able to produce longer-term data that can be used by a number of different actors. The social accountability platform is another platform that is used by the citizenry to get their feedback and their views on different programming, and these insights are then fed back to the programmers to adapt their own programming. And with the social accountability platform that we did the last few months in Somalia, we were able to get more than 3,600 views from the communities, and all of those insights were fed back to programmers. I'm on the second last slide. So again, just to show you very briefly how REDS has operated as a learning partner for different consortia in Ethiopia and in Somalia. We are only now starting to work a bit more consistently on Kenya, but this is the learning from Somalia and Ethiopia. To promote peer learning and to inform joint analysis based on a common agenda. So you can see that we are a learning partner, and I think Nassim also mentioned about the use of a learning partner to make sure that there's continuous learning and adaptation based on the evidence that is being produced. In Ethiopia, what we have done is to develop a common research agenda together with UNHCR and a number of other different actors to inform the application of the CRRF. I will share the presentation after, so I can move to the last slide. Okay, so I think in terms of key challenges, I'll just highlight a few of them. And as I had mentioned, we speak very different and varied language. So we need to really invest much more on these kinds of platforms, involving even more varied actors to collectively agree on even basic definitions and having a common understanding of what we want to influence together, and to really challenge our structures to do more and better together, particularly in the issue of protracted displacement and the search for durable solutions. And just also to mention that written publications will have a very limited effect in terms of sharing learning and building knowledge. So they need to be accompanied by other methods, such as providing a platform for dialogue and debate and discussion. They're not always going to be easy debates or discussions, but I think it's really the high time that we have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patience. Very, very interesting discussion and presentation on the use of data in the case of displaced people. And so now let's go for discussion, questions concerning data, concerning academics, concerning the use of research dedicated to humanitarian action. So we will proceed maybe by groups of 3 questions and have a total of maybe 10 questions, something like that. How long do we have, Virginie? About 20 minutes? A bit more. Okay, fantastic. So, so you are welcome. So yes?
Just a small question. What's the best practice in terms of ethical review when you have so many interested party in a research, national, international, etc.? So any challenge, or there's a good practice and it's easy in Kenya? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Another question, yes?
Thank you very much. My question would be on the sensitivity of data and how you get government to actually approve it. Because I know for many agencies, we're nervous to use any data that comes out that does not have the seal of government. Because otherwise we then start a whole nother process with government on where do you get these figures, how do you get these figures. I'd be interested to know how you get that approval so that we are clear the figures we're working on are also government approved figures, because they will inform planning, resourcing and all the rest. Thanks.
Thank you. A third question, and then we answer, and then we go for another batch. So, Madame.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the panelists. It's been very interesting to hear your presentations.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I would like to go back to the question that was asked regarding ethics review. Many of the things that we've heard about this afternoon I think this might be better. Okay, so just thanks again for your presentations. And also for the presentations and discussions of yesterday. I'm from Strathmore University and I'm very interested to hear these discussions. I also work with the Ethics Review Committee at the university, and I would be very interested to know how in the humanitarian field you manage the whole issue of ethics review. I know the matter has already been brought up, but I would like to get a bit more information on it, given that there are many ethics review committees working now in Kenya to approve local research. There's also the issue of the research permit that's required by NACOSTI. So anything on that would be very interesting. Thank you.
So, Maybe another one. No, we will. Yes, Idris?
Yeah, so just one question, and anyone can answer. But Nassim, I'm expecting you to at least respond to this one. So how do you involve young individuals, especially students at postgraduate learning within universities, as part of your research work, so in the various organizations? So that's one question. And the second one I'm interested in is what tools you use to give feedback to communities on your research findings. So, and in how do you translate it into, products that can be understood, internalized, and used at community level?
We will first answer to this question, then go for another batch. So, first, the practices. Practices who want to answer on this question, and the question of
So thank you for asking the two questions that are related on ethical review processes and research permits, which I was going to get to. I think all of you, if you don't know, the government needs to give a research permit for the research that's conducted. So oftentimes we're told, we didn't do that on our past research. It's fine, you can cut that 1 month process from your timeline. Actually, no, because we'll get in trouble, we'll lose our license if we do, and plus it's not ethical research practice. So we are supposed, in any context, Afghanistan, Somalia, Kenya, anywhere, there's different modalities, obviously, and different requirements. Kenya is more stringent on that than other contexts. Uganda is quite serious about that too. Ethiopia is changing its practices. It's a very dynamic setting, so I think just that could be a discussion and a takeaway in terms of where do you go as NGOs to make sure that you understand the processes of conducting research. But it's a definite requirement that many organizations still skip, and that limits the uptake by government for sure. But even when you do that, it's a checkbox exercise. So you get your research permit. It takes about a month here through NACOSTI. You do all the processes, but then there's no requirement to go back to the government and present the data. Or in Afghanistan now, increasingly, we've committed to translating our research so that the government can read it, because they won't necessarily be able to read in English. So these are very new practices, but I think the question of language and what we translate the outputs into is one that's definitely not a common practice. Still much of the outputs are in English. Whether they're brief or long, they're not translated in Swahili, in Somali, in Dari or Pashto. I mean, the practice on languages is lacking, and there's little funding for it. So when we try to argue for a budget line on translation, we're told, well, can you do it in-house? We're researchers, we're not translators. It's a different job. And a shout out to the translators in the back there who are doing a great job. So we really need to be able to invest in that. How do we involve young people, to go to your question? I didn't get into the background of who we are at Samuel Hall, but the idea is that we mix international and national researchers, and after a while, the internationals go and the national capacity remains. That's what we did in Afghanistan, and 10 years later, we had 20% Afghan researchers, 80% internationals, and now it's the opposite, and not just for security reasons, because I know that's what you'll say, but actually because we've been able to build capacity. So we usually hire interns, research assistants when they're in school, and then have them go up. We have an MOU with Strathmore now, and we're going to be able to do that as well. So this is how we do. And it's not just to provide the contextual analysis, but actually on Strathmore, for example, they have iLab Africa. They're going to partner with us to bring the technology insights into the migration field that we're known for. So we're really looking into tapping into local expertise and then also developing capacity. So they're part of our teams. And then in terms, just the last question, in terms of giving feedback, now in all of our research studies, we include community consultations, as Patience mentioned, at the end of any stay in a community, of any survey, we go back to the community, present our preliminary analysis, get their feedback, right or wrong, fill in any gaps, because there are always gaps, and get them to participate in that closure. So we kind of open it and close it with them. We didn't used to do that a year ago, so I'm not saying we've been doing this for a long time, but we're doing that now.
Thank you very much. You want to answer also, Patience, Maureen, on those questions?
I think I'll take the question on the sensitivity on data and how the governments, how we can use it if the governments do not approve, or how to go about government approval. And to be honest, there isn't a straightforward or right answer about this. But I think what's critical to realize is that sometimes we do not engage the governments in the actual collection of that data or in the development of the methodology. And we almost come to the government with, this is the data that we have. We have 2 million IDPs in your country. And they will definitely push back because, one, they don't agree on the methodology, they don't agree on the data collection, they don't agree on quite a number of things, which I think sometimes would have been solved or attempted to have been solved if we had involved the government from the very beginning. Again, the other thing is the fact that sometimes when we talk about capacity development with the government, specifically on the data or statistical systems, it's really critical to support the expertise also of the government to have, really strong statistical systems, and also to support the harmonization of the methodology and the data collection alongside with the government. And our capacity building really needs to go beyond just trainings to institutional capacity strengthening, and not only that, but really building the trust between humanitarian actors, development actors and the government, because the trust, I think, is really what is the missing link. There isn't almost any trust between the government and the humanitarian actors. So the minute you produce any data, you shoot yourself on the foot immediately. But I think there are steps that can be taken to address that. It's not going to be perfect, and I don't have like a perfect answer to that, and perhaps my colleagues can also contribute to that. I think the other thing that we need to do better is political economy analysis, and to really understand the incentive structures around which these policies are being made. I think that's a critical point that we need to take forward.
Maureen? No? About the sensitivity of data, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. The challenge is that, well, maybe I'll give an example from just the experience that the Red Cross had last year during the floods, was that the challenge is that sometimes you're saying, okay, this many people are affected, but the government doesn't necessarily accept that. But at the end of the day, part of what we need to do as humanitarian actors is we can't say, okay, I can't really tell you how many people are affected, and yet these people are affected, and there's something you need to do about it. So as humanitarians, it's pretty much what's our mandate, what's the role we're supposed to do. Should we go around worrying about the sensitivity of the data versus taking the actions you're supposed to take as humanitarian actors, right? So like last year, we had to go ahead and raise the funds that we needed to be able to help the people who are affected by the floods, right? But then in a sense, I think some of those are more of political discussions that we tend to leave with like the management to have the discussions with the relevant people in government to sort of ease out the tensions around the sensitivities of the data. But for us as humanitarians, the core thing is that can we make sure that that does not affect our ability to deliver the humanitarian assistance that's needed?
Thank you. Concerning I can add something concerning the practices and concerning the feedbacks. In fact, everything depends on the subject, on the thematic you are addressing. In this case, it is more the question of displacement, communities which have been displaced, social issues. Of course, you can also design research in practice from the beginning according to a protocol where you build your research project. The starting point is really the cooperation with the community. The starting point is the feedback to the community. And concerning this issue, also you can also work with local universities, with the institutions which are building capacities in the country. And you are not. You can work in an international frame, but the first, I would say, the first partner can be if the local the national higher education system. And in such cases, this is not anymore a question of the question of permits, of relationship with NACOSTI, etc. is there, of course. But the main question is to be in partnership with the people who create knowledge in the country. So that's just a point like that. Now, other questions? Yes, George?
Well, thank you. I found these presentations extremely interesting. But I just wanted to make the observation that to generate high quality data and information is obviously an area that requires some very high level training. My own experience would be that even within universities themselves, there's a lot of challenge in terms of getting people who can actually crack proper number. Although I noticed that here we are using data and information almost the same, but I would imagine that there's room for the humanitarian actors to really partner with, in a very serious way, to generate reliable and accurate data, if at all, if this is really used to lead to convincing decision. I don't know to what extent, say, REDS has that capacity. When you work, say, as you say, in Somalia or Ethiopia, and that is. But overall, I was very impressed by the fact that you also seem to be saying that policy making is not the end of the cycle. You actually then get back to communities. But I imagine that at that point also you really need very high level, accurate and convincing and persuasive data. And there's a lot of room for working with serious departments, not all departments in any university. And I don't know how you manage to mitigate that fairly complex area. Thank you.
So I have two questions. First, thank you to the panel for very interesting presentations. So my first question is actually picking up on what George was asking. And I would like to hear from patients a bit more on the challenges they were facing with while working with local academia. And also to pick Maureen's presentation on academic partners, I couldn't help but notice that there were no local institutions involved, and I just want to know why. What are those gaps in there? And then the second question is something that actually came up a bit earlier, and it's an ethical one, and it's twofold. So as a national society, we have access to a lot of historical data that has research value. But then how do we, what are the ethics around utilizing this to improve humanitarian programming? That is for historical data, but at the same time, Professor Mudida earlier was talking about behavioral science. And to me, this is a bit tricky because as a humanitarian institution, our main aim is to basically do no harm and respond equally to everyone, yeah? But when you do some of this sort of research, you have a homogeneous group, and then you have your test and your control. So one group gets the benefit, the other one don't, and it raises a very ethical conundrum in my head. It keeps me awake at night. So if you can help me answer this, I'll be very grateful.
Thank you. I'm Samuel from Strathmore University. My area of expertise is data science or predictive analytics. So I was keen on the presentations by Patience and by Maureen. So The question I have is, of course, I need to reiterate what a friend asked there, why there is no involvement with the local learning institutions. Because my understanding of collaboration is that it can be a pretty expensive affair. So, and ideally, this whole process that we are engaged in is essentially aimed at the optimal utilization of the resources that we have, which are not enough in the first place. So having local involvement, then that means you have people who have an understanding of the local context, people who can reach out to communities at a deeper level than engagement on an external level. And especially because those collaborations cannot really be sustainable in the long term, in the sense that we cannot have researchers come here and, basically stick around for as long as the expertise is required. Number two, to patients, it's tied to that. As far as predictive analytics goes, which is essentially meant to foresee the future and preempt some of the challenges that we've been experiencing over and over again, we rely so much on historical data. So essentially the studies that we are conducting right now, the quality, the data that we are producing may not be able to produce high quality models that can be able to help us foresee 10 years ahead of time. However, if you go back 10 years back, then that data is very important. And you have access to a large consortium of NGOs who are sitting on data that goes back tens of years. And that's actually the data we require as experts to be able to show you what is going to happen 10 years from now, and that is going to inform policy and all the interventions that you come up with. So the question then is, how do we first focus on what we have, which is very, very important, because what we are producing right now will be useful in a couple of years. So essentially is the quality of the predictions we make and the models we create is as good as the amount of data we use. And that amount of data is a function of how long we've been doing it, and that is what you have access to. So essentially it's how can you link that kind of data, or how can you convince your the consortium, your partners, those people you collaborate with, to create some sort of access to that data and then let it be accessible to the pool of skilled experts that we actually have locally, and then we can see how that can inform your goals and all that. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question there? Yeah, sir. Oh, yeah. Okay, you and then, yeah, of course.
Thank you. Mine is about the accuracy of data generated by the government and humanitarian agencies. I've worked with humanitarian organizations, I've worked with the government. But in all cases, to be fair, the data generated is very inaccurate. Very inaccurate. For the government, if you go to maybe any government agency and ask, how was this data generated? They can't tell you. That's number one. Number two, for political reasons, the data is either exaggerated or reduced. We did a mapping for school in relation to water project. The number of school-going children we got from that particular county, we got 3 conflicting data on the school feeding program. So we had a problem. When it comes to humanitarian organizations, most of the time when they are doing, they engage consultants, and most of these consultants are foreigners. So when they collect the data, one, they're not able to contextualize the data. So decision-making becomes a problem. And when you asked what were the variables, data collection, the most important is the variables that you consider. So both the government and humanitarian organizations will tell you what are the variables that they have considered. What were the independent and dependent, and other variables in between that can really bring misleading information. So my concern is the accuracy of the data we get from the government I got from our government and humanitarian were really inaccurate. But what is the solution? I think this is the high time we need to bring university on board, right? So that this data can become very valid for decision making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marie-Thérèse, you.
Merci, et merci beaucoup pour ces échanges. Ce que je veux dire ici, ce n'est pas vraiment une question, mais c'est plus une contribution. Je voudrais dire ici que dans le domaine de la recherche, puisqu'on parle de la collaboration entre les différents acteurs qui mènent des recherches dans un domaine bien précis, aujourd'hui on parle de l'humanitaire. Ce qui est important à comprendre, c'est que la recherche, la collaboration suppose que ceux qui mènent de la recherche construisent ensemble. Moi, je pense que c'est un élément fondamental. Quand je dis ici construire ensemble, ça veut dire qu'on va se mettre d'accord sur la démarche à suivre pour traiter un domaine, un sujet. Bien sûr, dans le respect des particularités des uns et des autres. Lorsqu'on est universitaire, on a une façon d'aborder les questions. Et lorsqu'on est praticien sur le terrain, la démarche est tout aussi différente. Donc, l'essentiel pour nous, c'est de se mettre d'accord, de construire ensemble et d'évoluer ensemble et de définir ensemble des méthodologies qui nous permettent d'atteindre des résultats. Et deuxième chose, il faut savoir que la recherche a des objectifs à atteindre pour des uns et des autres. Pour les académiciens, l'objectif est de produire des connaissances. C'est-à-dire, on ne peut pas faire autrement parce que c'est une demande, parce que c'est une vocation, c'est une mission. Mais d'un autre côté, la recherche doit permettre aussi une professionnalisation des praticiens. C'est-à-dire que ceux qui sont sur le terrain ont besoin d'améliorer leurs connaissances, d'améliorer leurs pratiques. Donc, comment articuler ces deux demandes dans une même recherche? Je crois que c'est là le challenge. C'est vraiment dans le respect, puisqu'on parle de l'éthique, et dans le respect des uns et des autres. En fait, c'est un point de vue. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. We will start by commenting those few questions, and then we will go for another batch. So let's start with the question of the importance of local institutions, context.
Thank you. So indeed, as I had mentioned earlier in my presentation, we are working very closely with local institutions. So we always aim to create this partnership between the international institutions that are working on research and also the local institutions. And sometimes the challenges that we do face, particularly with local institutions, is really a limited capacity, and not necessarily limited capacity with regards to skill, but limited capacity with regards to the institutional capacity. So you find in terms of how humanitarian actors, sometimes we do even basic things like our procurement, oftentimes blocks out local institutions from even applying or bidding for the research process. And that is a key challenge that we've had to really grapple with and to adjust our systems to be able to accommodate local institutions that will not necessarily have all the procurement standards that are internationally required, but also being able to maintain a level of accountability, a level of our own internal risk management, and our own internal systems of making sure that we remain accountable. Because that has been a key challenge. Another key challenge has been also with regards to engagement of universities. universities. And only now we've started to really engage with universities. As you know, our approaches are quite different, and it takes time to build that common approach to be able to really work together and to agree on common objectives. And I think, like Marie said, with regards to different objectives and different accountabilities, because for the universities and the researchers, the accountability is really on knowledge building and producing knowledge. Our accountability, on the other hand, is to improve programming for displacement affected communities, and sometimes we end up speaking a bit of different or varied languages, and the concepts are quite diverse. So it takes time to build this partnership, and it takes time to build this collaboration, and I think that's what we are slowly working towards. That's the question in partnership with local institutions, and then there was also a question about, should I address the longitudinal? Yeah, so a question about data and going back to historical data and also addressing the data that we currently have. And the approach that we're taking now is really to conduct these longitudinal solutions analysis or longitudinal studies that are not one-off studies, but that look at a particular population over time, maybe 4 or 5 years. And what we do is to package that information within a dashboard. It's an online dashboard that is accessible, it's easily accessible, and it can be used by a very wide range of different actors, because you can almost find yourself within that dashboard. So I think it's really critical to make sure that we are really transparent, because again, the issue is not that the data is not there, but it's that the data is not accessible, because we are very protective of our data as a humanitarian agency. So what we're doing is really encourage our membership and partners to make the data a lot more accessible and to make the data analytical, because if it's not analytical, then it really is not useful. So, and to package it in an online dashboard that is, so with the online dashboard, it's on the 8 criteria. And like I said, with the 8 criteria, not one agency can address all the different aspects of that. So we collect data from a very broad range of different actors and put it together in one place. So and the whole objective really is accessibility. So yeah, in terms of.
Thank you very much. Maureen, you want to react also on this question?
Yeah, so the question on local universities, I did say at the end that the engagement of local Kenyan universities could have been enhanced. And before I answer the question, maybe I would throw it back in terms of what's the barrier to Kenyan universities or local universities accessing some of these global research and humanitarian action funds. I think some of which Patience has said, but then it's something for the local universities to go and interrogate, because the reality is that some of the projects we're implementing, for example, on the forecast-based financing, are put out there. So for example, the FOPAC project is under the Science for Humanitarian and Emergency Resilience. And it's something that is put up by the UK National Environment Research Council together with the UK government. And a lot of times they put out calls for proposals. So it's really up to the Kenyan universities to be able to do what they need to do to be part of the consortium applying for it, yeah? But then I think you got lost in just seeing the UK universities and forgot that there were Kenyan institutions as part of the consortium. For example, Kenya Red Cross, the Kenya Meteorological Department, the National Drought Management Authority, they are part of that. I mean, they're not researchers, but it's really for them for us bringing in the practice side into what the researchers, unfortunately mostly from the UK and Europe, are trying to investigate, making sure that it also has the local context into it. But yeah, I totally agree that we can do more to work with the Kenyan universities. And I think one of the approaches we are trying to do is, for example, the relations we are building with the ICCA, that's the university where Professor Wandiga is coming from. And interestingly enough, the Belmont call that he mentioned in the morning is something that Kenya Red Cross is a partner in that call. So we are not ignoring the fact that we definitely need to work with local universities. Yeah, thanks.
Just one mention on this point, just so that you don't get all the heat for not having local partners. It's where the money comes from, very oftentimes. The other day, I was told we're a financial risk for a UK $20 million project. Why are we a financial risk? Because we're local. because we don't necessarily have all the administrative processes that universities in the UK have. So very often, that selection is not made at their level, but is made at the upper level. And also, to be honest, in the context of Brexit and everything else, the UK government right now is channeling research funds and even development money through British universities. So that's how the money goes. So I think, you really need to look upstream, and that's where maybe there's a link with policy there as well, is to push the government of Kenya to have certain standards and certain requirements, that when research is led here, it should have a component of local research inclusion. So I think that's where we need to push, because otherwise we won't be included, and I include myself in the local research institutes. On what keeps you up at night, and I don't want you to lose sleep anymore, on the control groups and how we do research. In our experience, for example, that type of research where we do indeed focus, let's say, on refugee returnees or IDPs, and our control group are the host communities, what that has allowed us to do is to tell UNHCR, actually, your target group focused, mandate focused intervention is no longer relevant, because those needs are actually the needs of the entire community. So they're not displacement specific vulnerabilities, they're vulnerabilities in that area. So that's where you move from targeted group-based programming to area-based programming. That's where you can link up with national development policies. So I think that's where we need to really use that data to push that whole mandate versus actual needs, humanitarian development nexus, and really get it there.
Yes.
Just to make also one clarification, that REDS is not, we don't do primary data collection, and we are not data experts in that sense. So we always engage research institutions such as Samuel Hall and other research institutions to conduct the researches.
Thank you. We now have time for, yes? Yes, Virginie.
Okay, I would like to follow up on Marie-Thérèse's question on working together, and also on all the presentation. It's true that it's kind of music to our ears, because we are all sharing the same concern, exactly the same. So it's good to hear, and maybe we can also discuss out, because we really need to move forward. So being a research entity actually embedded in a civil society organization, because we're part of the French Red Cross family, it's not easy, and we are happy this is a conversation we have in Ibiza, because it's the same thing. They have been created by their national society. We are research initiative, but belonging to very operational and civil society organizations. So our job is to make sure that we link together the research and the practices with the fragilities of the people. As Marie-Thérèse said, we must work together. Fact is, it's not easy, because it's two different worlds. Although you can find some researchers in the operational area and vice versa, but it's only a few. So actually, we have to think ourselves how we are the best interface as possible between the two worlds. And we must respond to the two expectations from the academic world and from the Red Cross or civil society world. But I think, and this is something we share, I think, with ICHA, that it is a job in itself. For example, for us, we see first now, after a couple of years of experience, first as a translator. So you were speaking about mapping the needs. In our office, we are about 500. All my colleagues are on the field. They have a lot of needs, but actually not all needs transferred in a question of research. And we had to develop tool, actually, because they said, maybe we need you for that, but actually maybe half of the question were not research questions. And we have to develop meetings that are and tools with fish to say, okay, have you asked yourself this? Have you asked yourself this? And then this is research, and we have no kind of, we have meetings where we spend hours trying to understand what is a research question about. Also, it's a question of governance. So, for example, in our board, we have a mix of Red Cross people, operational from other NGO, but also academic institution. And we had to build a super strong scientific board to evaluate, we are speaking about quality, to evaluate all the research that is going through the foundations. If we didn't have this strong and mixed governance, it wouldn't work because they need to discuss together what they expect from each other. So this is something in the models that we need to consider. Also, we are a kind of mediator. We need to negotiate always. So from the operational side, I need to negotiate time. For example, the data is an issue. So for example, we decided everything that we produce as a fondation reconnue d'utilité publique. So we must be useful in our own status, and is a notion of common goods. So everything that we produce must be useful to the biggest number of people as possible. So the question of data, so we had to develop specific contract to work with jurists to make sure that the researcher own its own data, is free to use its own data, can publish, and so on. So we also need to work with the financial people on our account to say, okay, Virginie, when you have a grant, you give a grant to a colleague in Madagascar, how you make sure that you will finish the research, and which result, how do we measure that you have expected outcome? Say, no, this is research. Actually, we have to accept that research can have a different answers and it was planned before, and so on. So it's all this trying to find the compromise that you were talking about, and it's on all sides. So juridic, data communication, everything. Also with the funding, as you said, Nassim, I think it's a question of who is paying at the end, because there is little funds. Actually, everything we are doing, like trying to bridge the humanitarian and the research, you can have huge budget for other areas, but for research, you have to realize that it's very, very little money available, and it's really super hard. So also, what are the expectations? We must sensitive the donor. That's what we do, that now. Please accept that the researcher will publish, because if it don't publish, it doesn't benefit to the whole people, you don't share experience, so it's, you know. And also, as a agent révélateur was one, is in I think it was in your French word, or facilitator, at how we make sure that on the research side we really value what has been done, and on the operational side we also value what has been researched. It can be with the communities that has been interviewed, or with our colleague working in the field every day. So I think this is a new kind of job, and we need to share also a lot of practice, because this is not easy. What we have done actually at the end is that it's all a question also on values, on how, why, and in which sense you produce research when we work with the humanitarian sector. So we have to write our own charter, so people understand when they come and challenge the foundation for research, they have to understand it won't be done in 3 months. It's require patience, it's required to respect research deontology, and also from a research side that it needs to be useful, that we need to have kind of recommendation that we can then decline into concrete program as well. But it is just the start of a conversation, I guess.
Yes, so we will take now 2 last questions before to close by 5 minutes. So, yes, you, madam, in the end.
Hi, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, so this is Cheng from ICRC. I think, you know, this thing about data sharing, I totally agree, but my experience working with different organizations is that often the organizations are not comfortable with data sharing because they're not confident with the methodology used, right? And I think this is a key issue that we have to address. So it's not like they don't want to, it's just they don't want to be washing their dirty laundry, so to speak, no? That's one. And then just to give an example, I mean, because so far we've been talking about multi-stakeholders and all, I can just share with you the experience working with the IDP Monitoring Center in Geneva, IDMC, where it was one organization, but I was in part of the process of harmonizing data, time series data, you know, comparative data of different countries, IDPs, you know, of different countries, but over like 20 years. And it was a nightmare. And this is one organization, yeah? It's just talking about data that's been collected consistently over the years for many different countries. But the methodology was evolving, and it really depended on who the analyst was responsible for that specific countries or region, right? So I think this is something that will come again and again, right? We'll face. And I had the opportunity of taking the nutrition smart methodology data training last year, and you know, opportunity to work with nutritionists. And I think we can learn a bit from the nutritionists here, because they there was a big group of them, you know, like NGOs, academics, researchers, etc., UNICEF including, who worked on a common methodology, right? It's a dominant methodology. There's a lot of dissemination, a lot of trainings done. And here I would like to just look at Michael Olson's you know, theory of collective action, where you need one actor that has a dominant interest, you know, that would invest more than everyone else in order to come up with something, a public good, so to speak, no? So I see this common methodology as a common group, and I agree with Nassim that NGOs can play a very big part, because I think, if I'm not wrong, because I'm not a nutritionist, I think smart methodology was a lot supported by ACF, you know, being one of the dominant partners. So I don't know, I think this is something we can learn from, perhaps, but I'm just theorizing here, so please, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Professor.
Thank you. I'll just make quick observations. And I wanted to ask this, probably for all of us who are in the room who generate data. How do you store the data that you generate? How do you store it? Where do you keep it? Besides the sharing. And then I think there was the issue of after we generate that data and then we write, you know, 100-page document. And then I am sitting as the director of, for example, immigration. Would you expect me to read that document? Will I have the time? Now, to share with you my little experience is that I'm involved in a project, but this is university, and this is the difference. The project is that we have engaged a postdoc whose job is actually to analyze research results and download them to a language, you know, that will be understandable, would be easily consumed by policymakers, so that, of course, this will not be possible in every case, but I guess when necessary, it is something worth thinking about, because it's one of the areas, for example, our local universities can help. It doesn't have to be a postdoc. It could be something that requires a master's person or a PhD candidate, and it's a good experience. The third thing that I wanted to observe is that even though we talk about linkages between the industry itself, that is the humanitarian sector, and we hardly share. For example, and I'm not proud to say this, many of us here who are Kenyans in the room may not even know that, for example, Moi University offers a master's degree in forced migration, which has been there for the last 10 years. I know what Samuel Hall does because of my interest. I know what REDS does. I didn't know about Isha, for example. So you can see that maybe, and this is what I wanted to throw back to especially to our local, to Kenyans who are here. How do we move what is the next step? Or we wait for another conference like this, 2 years? What's the next step so that this kind of conversation can be carried and the little bits and pieces can come into a reality so that I can share with Professor Wandiga, I can share with Maureen that this is going on and this is going on. So those are my observations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we will conclude on just what you just said, because it is very relevant for all of us. In fact, how this question on data, on reliability of data, on the robustness, the share, the information of data, and the analysis, of course, we cannot separate it from the initial objective. We target data according to objectives, to questions, and so that's there is a dialogue to establish in between humanitarian action, science, on the questions, on the data, on the way to analyze it, on the way to involve the local community, the local partners in this, in order to produce solutions. And of course, we should not wait for the next conference, but say there will be another conference at least, so this is already something. And so we can think about it, we can think to the different entry points we would provide in this debate, and we can think to the levers we have to activate in order to make the linkages between research and humanitarian actions more effective in solving the biggest issues, which are also gaps of knowledge in the region. Thank you very much. Maybe Virginie, you want to say something?
Yes, so maybe one of the answers will be look at ICHA and maybe Foundation WhatsApp. We try to actually, the conference is just the beginning of the conversation, so we hope it continue. For example, we have an opening call for research on cash transfer, and we are looking for postdocs. So of course, your researchers are the first concern, and we hope that we have some postdoc from universities here or others from other countries. Now, it is true that where all the data are stored, it really depends also if you produce quantitative or qualitative research. For us, it's clear that the data is owned by the researcher. We publish the result only, and as you said, is how we make it accessible in other formats. So we have worked 1 year. As you say, we also had to employ someone. It's Louise working with Vincent. Louise is here. She also coordinated the seminar. Thank you, Louise, by the way. Yeah, 1 year of work, as you said, to produce the new publication, which is called Practices and Humanities. That is only 4 pages. So we translate our 30 pages scientific article in very synthetic, and since we release, it's very much used by everyone, I must say. So yes, so I think this is something that we can share. We continue to work as network and share our tools as well, and let's continue to work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe first I'll answer the question around storing data. I think the data is still in reports somewhere on somebody's computer, but actually I think the Red Cross system has done quite a lot to put out the information it has. So for example, all the appeals that we make under the Disaster Risk Emergency Fund, if you go on the FRC website, you can get all the reports, for example, on the actions that Kenya Red Cross has done, the amount of money that was raised, the actions that were taken, the results of that. The reports can be found online. There's also a platform called Go, where you can go literally and get different kinds of information about what the Red Cross is doing across the world. But then coming back to ICHA and what we are doing under the focus-based financing approach is that we are increasingly working with the data people, and part of what they're creating is what we are calling a community risk assessment dashboard. If you can find Steve at some point, he will tell you the details of that. And part of that is us trying to compile the data that we have as the Red Cross, but also synthesizing and compiling other forms of data that are out there in terms of vulnerability, exposure, coping capacity, to come up with a kind of risk information that anybody can access. So one of the things that we're really focusing on is having access to open source data and making the data that we generate also open source. In terms of next steps, thankfully Idris will speak at the end, so he can speak specifically about ICHA. But for me, personally, I think we have tried to reach out to local universities in some of the work that we are doing, but I think we can put a lot more effort on that, because we do have a lot of questions that researchers can help us address and can also inform the practice that we are doing, but also allow us to be able to do our regular job and to get you to support the things that we need to address, but maybe do not have the expertise or the time to be able to put that in.
Thank you very much. That's what's called upward delegation from Maureen on a high note. So could we please give a hand to the panel? Thank you very much, Basim, Patience, and Maureen.